Welcome back to EigenLayer Unlocked virtual event. Today we have Toghrul from Scroll.
Welcome to EigenLayer Unlocked, an interactive educational journey through the EigenLayer ecosystem created by technical founders and builders for the entire crypto community. A special thank you to our partners, AltLayer, Polymer, Authentic, Skate, and Lagrange for helping to make this happen. Our goal is to raise the collective knowledge of the EigenLayer AVS ecosystem and unpack the technical designs of the top teams in the space. Welcome to EigenLayer Unlocked.
Welcome back to EigenLayer Unlocked virtual event. Today we have Toghrul from Scroll, following a fun presentation from Modular March several months back about modularity being a meme. Today he is filling the role of the myth of shared security. So glad to have you back, man. I know Robbie's wishing he was here. He's on a flight, but that's all good. And looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, today I decided to follow up on what we discussed last time and to talk about the myth of shared security. Or I think another way to title it is why the lack of shared security is actually good. So L2s, restaking protocols, trustless, and quotation marks, bridges, what do they have in common? They all rely on shared security, or to be more precise, shared security in quotation marks. So before I proceed, let's first define what shared security is. So shared security in the most layman terms is when a protocol A and protocol B share security if and only if the failure of the latter always results in the failure of the former and vice versa. So they're completely interdependent. We can formalize it, but first, in this case, fail doesn't mean a project not being successful. So a not so successful project can still be, in terms of like user base, etc., can still fail in terms of its security. So that's what we're talking about here. It has nothing to do with the success of the project. So let's say we have a function failure that defines an arbitrary failure of the protocol. And then it can basically cause a failure of protocol A. And so shared security is when a failure of protocol A causes the failure of protocol B. So it's equivalent. And so, for example, in a scenario where you have shared security, every time an L2 fails, the underlying L1 also fails. Every time a restaking protocol fails, the underlying L1 also fails. Every time a trustless bridge fails, the underlying L1 also fails. But before we proceed, I just wanted to highlight one thing. Trustless bridges actually do not exist. It's another myth. I'm not going to go into it because it's unrelated to the discussion today, but just as a side note, whenever somebody says that there's a trustless bridge, just ignore them. They're probably just
Yeah, I mean, that word is blasphemy in crypto and in blockchain. But I think that so real quick on your definition of shared security, basically it's two parts. So protocol A and protocol B share security if and only if the failure of the latter always results in the failure of the former and vice versa. And so applying this to restaking, basically we have Ethereum validators that are engaging in proof of stake, and then we restake this Ethereum to then extend this security to, in EigenLayer's case, AVSs and kind of other services that use this restaked ETH. But those services aren't exactly inheriting the security of the underlying base ETH. It's this restaked ETH that they're underlying. And so how do you put this definition of shared security more into the context of the relationship between Ethereum validators and the restaked ETH that is being used to extend the security of those validators?
There's no shared security. I'll expand on it later. There's actually no shared security here. You can argue that there's some form of shared security from the perspective of slashing. If you have deterministic slashing, that you can say that Ethereum enforces slashing conditions for the AVSs, but that's only the case if there is deterministic slashing. But even then, I wouldn't call it shared security. It's shared accountability almost. Like Ethereum enforces the guarantees that it'll enforce slashing conditions in case any occur.
Okay, so for the rest of this conversation, we are of the understanding that, from your perspective, shared security is, again, protocol A and protocol B. Shared security, if and only if the failure of the latter always results in the failure of the former, and vice versa. So basically, if one goes down, the other goes down, regardless, because they're sharing the same economic security, or they're sharing some security model that requires them to be both, running, if you will.
Yeah, they're completely interdependent. So if one fails,
Correct.
the other also should fail with no exceptions.
Got it. All right.
So I lost where I was. Oh yeah, I was here. So yeah,
Right here,
trusted processes do not exist. Whatever. It's just a side note. Isn't really related to this discussion. But yeah. So do those claims actually hold in real world? Is it true that every time an L2 fails, the underlying L1 also fails? Luckily, we haven't really historically had any major L2 failures, but there were liveness failures, etc., like certain censorship, etc. And basically, luckily, no. And you might ask why luckily. That sounds like a bad thing. But actually, I don't think it is. And the reason why I think luckily is a good reason is like, yes, simple answer is yes, luckily. But a more complex answer would be not having full shared security enables us to deploy hundreds of different instances of L2s with different experimental properties, different restaking protocols, etc., without risking basically failing everything that is related to it. Because think of it this way: if there are, I think there are around 80 L2s currently deployed on Ethereum. If shared security was true, then every time a single L2 failed, the L1 would have failed, and because it shares the security with other L2s, those L2s would have failed as well, which means that you have a cascading effect where every time there's a failure of a single L2, everything fails, which is not a good design. And so, yeah, as I just described, imagine a failure of a single L2 caused a cascading failure of all the other L2s restaking protocols and the base layer. It's not a good design. And so I think from this perspective, not having shared security is a good thing, because you can ensure that certain properties are inherited, and I'll cover that later. But you also ensure that the failures are isolated. So if one fails, nothing else fails. Of course, you can argue that, like in case of EigenLayer and Restaked ETH, if a big portion of ETH is slashed, then it'll have an impact on Ethereum, but it will not cause Ethereum to fail. It'll cause the security, the economic security properties to drop, etc., but it will not result in the failure of Ethereum. And the correct question would be, does that mean that shared security is a scam? Well, it's not that simple. The simple answer is no. And the reason why that's the case is because protocol can share partial security or partial economic security. Theoretically, protocols can also share full security. Let's say in case where all the ETH that are staked in Ethereum are also restaked, then it will be sharing full security. EigenLayer will be sharing full security with Ethereum. But realistically, it's unlikely to be the case ever that 100% of staked ETH is also restaked into EigenLayer. So in most cases, it'll be partial economic security. And so, as an example, a stage 2 rollup deployed on Ethereum shares the following guarantees with Ethereum, which means that it shares the following security with Ethereum. So one is data availability, which is basically your ability to download the relevant data to reconstruct the state within a given amount of time. So let's say the Ethereum makes the data available, and it guarantees that if you want to download it within, let's say, a week or 2 weeks, you'll always be able to. After that, if you're talking about historic data, the protocol itself doesn't guarantee it, but because you have so many services built on top of it, such as block explorers, RBCs, etc., especially for big projects like Ethereum, it's unlikely that you're ever going to have a case where you are unable to retrieve the data from somewhere else, historic data. Second is ordering, which is a side effect of data availability, which means that once the set of transactions is ordered in a certain way, so for example, transaction 1 comes after transaction 2, transaction 2 comes after transaction 1, etc., then it'll always stay the same as long as Ethereum functions properly. So it will always guarantees once the ordering is finalized that the ordering will stay the same. And third property is eventual censorship resistance. That's done through forced inclusion, which means that basically, in case the L2 is censoring, you can always force the transaction that the L2 is censoring, its inclusion through the L1. And finally, Ethereum enforces attestations to correctness for a rollup, which is different from correctness guarantees because Ethereum cannot guarantee that the rollup is correct. It can just guarantee that the state transition that it attested to is correct, based on the fact that the fraud proof or the zero knowledge proof that is used by said rollup is functioning correctly. So if it's not functioning correctly, Ethereum can do nothing about it, and the funds can be stolen, etc. And then let's go to restaking protocols.
Just briefly, Toghrul. On those 4 components of the stage 2 rollup, I put out this tweet the other day. I'm still trying to really wrap my head around how this works. And the tweet was basically like the data availability part of the blockchain, whether it be using Ethereum or using EigenDA or Celestia or something else, is more important to the quote unquote finality of the chain than the Ethereum base layer itself, in the sense that being able to reconstruct the blocks of the state in a given period of time is the most important part of a roll-up's kind of ability to do a hard fork or kind of attest to its validity. And then kind of the Ethereum L1 is just there to confirm the validity of the data that has been posted, and then basically publish the block and run the state transition function. So that's like a mental model that I'm working with, and I'm still trying to kind of really fully finalize. How are you thinking about this? The idea between where in the stage 2 rollup where Ethereum L1 enforces these attestations to correctness and then runs the data availability, both of those within a stage 2 rollup. How does which in that relationship, which is the more important quote unquote part of that puzzle to the rollup's finality and security, and kind of why?
So in terms of finality, I would say it's Ethereum, because Ethereum is responsible for the ordering. So let's say if the DA layer, I don't know, it doesn't matter. Let's say you use Celestia as a DA layer. It declares that a certain ordering is the canonical one, but Ethereum rejects it because there's a certain forced transaction that was supposed to be included beforehand. Then Ethereum basically rejects that ordering. And so Ethereum is the final instance in terms of determining what ordering is correct and therefore which data you should source. Of course, in terms of sourcing the data, then the DA layer is more important, because even if Ethereum says that a certain thing is correct, but you're unable to recover that data, then it doesn't matter what Ethereum says. So there are two different things here. In terms of who has the final say, it's always Ethereum. In terms of who plays a most important role for actually making that data available to you for you to retrieve it, then it's the DA layer, of course.
Yeah. And when you say forced transaction, what exactly do you mean by a forced transaction that would cause some sort of invalid state transition?
So an example, so usually, and I'll use Arbitrum terminology, but that's not the way Arbitrum works. But an example of a design, for example, let's say usually rollups have two inboxes: the sequencer inbox, which is the L2 transactions that are ordered and published, and then the second inbox is called the delayed inbox. Is the inbox of the L1 to L2 messages. So let's say if you deposit the L1 ETH on an L1 to the L2 contract, it takes some time to be processed and actually be deposited on your L2 into your L2 wallet. And that can be used for forced inclusion as well. So in terms of the design, the bridge is usually agnostic, whether it's an L1 to an L2 message or a forced inclusion, it treats them the same way. And usually how it works, there's a delay. So it sets a timer, let's say, 24 hours, until when that transaction has to be processed. And if the transaction is not processed by the L2 within that time frame, then the L1 can force the inclusion of that transaction into the L2. And so the way you can design it, so there are a few different designs. For example, in Arbitrum, after that delay expires, anyone can call the bridge and basically move that transaction from the delayed inbox into the sequencer inbox, making it canonical. But you can also design it in a way where it's more automated. So let's say if the sequencer publishes an ordering, but it doesn't include the first transaction into the queue after the delay expired, then the bridge will just reject that ordering, because it will always give priority to that transaction that has an expired delay on it. And therefore, in this design, the Ethereum the bridge always has the last say of what the ordering is, and therefore what the finalized ordering is. And as a result, you can derive the finalized state, et cetera, from it. And therefore, that's why I was saying that Ethereum always plays the bigger role in terms of determining the finality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I now understand deeper, like the forced inclusion concept and why those forced transactions are important. So it's just kind of like broadly for Ethereum, for stage 2 rollup today, based on our current definition that we have established about shared security, these 4 properties that you spoke on are the key 4 things that exist in a stage 2 rollup that would, if any of these happened, then or if any failure of any of these properties happened at either level, it would cause the other to fail. But like, I don't know if it's a silly question, but if the rollup stopped posting data to Ethereum or something, then Ethereum wouldn't fail. Like, how does a stage 2 rollup, like, it can never cause the L1 to fail, could it?
So that's why I didn't mention liveness, because Ethereum can never guarantee liveness for the L2. It can only be guaranteed by. But let's say as an example, so eventual censorship resistance with delayed forced inclusion. The only way that delayed forced inclusion can fail is if Ethereum fails. So because it's enforced by the smart contract. Obviously, we're abstracting away from the bugs, because if we were to include the bugs and like the assumptions that all the smart contracts are not completely bug-free, etc., then we'll have a completely theoretical and useless discussion about how nothing ever shares any properties whatsoever. But I think, like, for sake of this discussion, let's assume that everything is ideally implemented and there are no bugs. And essentially, like in case of eventual censorship resistance, the only way it cannot be enforced if Ethereum fails. So I'm not sure if shared security is even the right way to describe it, but it's essentially, I guess, yes, it is. So Ethereum is just like, is enforcing the security for the rollup in case of eventual censorship resistance. So that would be the case of shared security in with regards to this specific property. That doesn't mean that every other property. So for example, with regards to state transition correctness, Ethereum cannot enforce state transition correctness because it does not run the full nodes. It trusts that the proof mechanism that is used by the rollup, be it fraud proofs in case of optimistic rollups, or zero knowledge proofs in case of ZK rollups, are functioning correctly. And if they're not, then Ethereum has no way of enforcing and saying, oh, actually, you're being not truthful here. This is not how it works, and that's it.
Agreed. Okay, fantastic. So these are the 4 properties that and could you, so it's data availability, ordering, eventual censorship resistance, and the state transition function, the attestation of the correctness of the state transition.
Yeah.
For a rollup. But not actually, not like verifying the information of the transactions within the blocks of the L2s, just confirming that this is the correct block and the correct ordering, and it's been done on the L1. It's been
yes, and confirming that the proof that is used by the rollup has actually attested to correctly, because imagine a scenario in which let's say that the bridge is faulty and it cannot verify the correct proof, then you don't even know there are no guarantees in terms of what the state transition was. Whereas in here, there are certain guarantees. Obviously, it's not equivalent to Ethereum's guarantees, but there are guarantees that at least if the proof system is functioning correctly, then Ethereum is guaranteed to enforce it correctly.
Understood.
All right. So those were the properties that are shared by rollups, by stage 2 rollups with Ethereum. And in terms of restaking protocols, the ones that are deployed on Ethereum share partial economic security with Ethereum. So, and I explained before that you can theoretically assume that a restaking protocol can share full economic security with Ethereum, but in reality, it's unrealistic that it's ever going to happen. And so, to be more specific, it means that the funds that are utilized to secure Ethereum, ETH, the staked ETH, can be opted into also securing other protocols. In this case, it will be restaking protocols, and that's where the name restaking comes from. You stake an already staked asset, and so you get restaking. And by the way, restaking protocols do not have to utilize the native base layer asset for restaking. You can imagine a scenario in which EigenLayer accepts any other assets. I think they already announced the support of Ethena SUSD or whatever it's called by them. So, and you can imagine how they can extend it to other assets, even stable coins. Obviously, the risk parameters are different, but they can extend it to stable coins or other tokens. Obviously, there are certain requirements, and I'll talk about them in a bit. So, and actually, if you look at it, if you abstract away from this whole like shared security discussion, security provided by a restaking protocol backed by a certain amount of dollars, let's say $1 billion of a base layer native asset, so in this case ETH, or a non-native asset, let's say Aave, for example, is identical. The only difference that you can make, you can claim to make, is that basically you would need assets that have good liquidity and are available, because if the asset if the asset doesn't have liquidity and is extremely volatile, then those security properties can change quite drastically. Whereas with something like ETH, even though you can argue that it's also volatile, it's unlikely to lose 90% of its value in a day. So the volatility is quite different to, let's say, a meme coin. So it's unlikely that anyone will ever use meme. I guess people will, but like, but realistically, it's not a good idea to use meme coins to secure a restake protocol. But any other asset that has good liquidity and is not that volatile relative to meme coins, it can be used, and there's no difference from the protocol perspective. And so realistically, no security is shared. When we say shared economic security, we just mean that the assets are shared. There's no actual economic security shared per se, because you can imagine a scenario in which EigenLayer a certain AVS within EigenLayer fails, and Ethereum functions completely as intended. There's no repercussions, and so there's nothing shared there. It's just the underlying asset that is shared. There's obviously one caveat here, and one thing that is shared is that the base layer enforces the slashing conditions of the restaking protocol, which means that, and obviously we can argue that, let's say, in certain cases where slashing conditions are not deterministic, so they're voted by committee, in that case, obviously, the base layer doesn't enforce anything. It just enforces the attestation on the slashing condition being triggered. But let's say in a case where slashing conditions are deterministic, then the base layer actually enforces those slashing conditions. And I've done that before, and I think it's time to repeat it again. Let's roast some of the claims that L2s and restaking protocols make. So funnily enough, I went through quite a few of the rollups and L2 websites, and almost none of them make claims that they're fully secured by Ethereum, at least on the front page, which I was surprised about. I thought more people would be talking about that. But an example of this is Mantle. So secured by Ethereum, experience high throughput with unrivaled security with Ethereum's rollup technology, all in a familiar EVM environment. The correct way to say it would be partially secured by Ethereum. Then EigenLayer with shared security to hyperscale Ethereum, partially shared economic security to hyperscale Ethereum would be the correct way of saying it. And then Symbiotic with Symbiotic is a generalized shared security system enabling decentralized networks to bootstrap whatever. Symbiotic is a generalized partially shared economic security system enabling decentralized networks. So you can see how things actually sound different when you add those. Like it seems like a small change, but it actually makes a lot of difference at how it comes off. And I think I took enough of your time, so I will jump to a conclusion. Shared security is a myth, but it's actually a good thing that it is a myth, because otherwise everything would have failed because of one single component, which is not a good design in my opinion. So thank you very much.
Sweet. Yeah, a couple questions. I'll just pull the slides down. Okay, so this is just going to get straight to the bare bones of it. What is the biggest concern that you have with restaking right now? And how do you see this concern being addressed, or is it like being talked about and thought through? Generally speaking, what is your biggest concern about restaking?
I think my biggest concern is the fact that it can potentially introduce a cascading effect in terms of the risk for Ethereum from the perspective of the restaked ETH. So let's say if a big percentage of staked ETH is restaked into EigenLayer, then, and obviously most of the AVSs nowadays are either secured by multi-sigs or have no slashing, etc. It's not very fleshed out. And obviously this is not a criticism of its final form, because the same can apply to rollups. Most of the rollups currently are also secured by multi-sigs, etc. And obviously none of us want that. And so the end game for rollups is to avoid having those multi-sigs, etc. And the same is true with EigenLayer. But in its current design, it can, even though it won't result in long-term detrimental effects to Ethereum, but let's say if a mass slashing condition is triggered, or in case that a multi-sig failed, a lot of the ETH that is currently securing Ethereum is also going to be slashed. which means that Ethereum security budget, at least temporarily, is going to drop quite significantly. Obviously, the game theory dictates that if the amount of ETH stake decreases, then the yields will go up, and therefore more people are going to stake ETH, whatever. But at least temporarily, that's going to have a detrimental effect to the economic security of Ethereum.
And when you say the economic or the security budget, that's just like the total amount of ETH staked, basically.
Yes.
And in a slashing event, that number goes down because of slashing, and that could be problematic at a large scale.
Yeah. And again, I don't think it'll have a long-term impact. Let's say if something there's a mass slashing event on EigenLayer, it doesn't mean that in 2 years' time Ethereum is still going to be struggling with economic security, but at least short-term, it'll have an impact on the properties of Ethereum and the like economic security.
Yeah. So if you're thinking about building a roll-up in today's world versus building in AVS on EigenLayer on a different restaking protocol, like what are you thinking about as the differences for builders or for applications to deploy with different stacks? Like, is there a specific reason why application type A would want to be a roll-up versus an AVS or vice versa? How are you thinking about the landscape between launching new rollups versus launching AVSs or restaked protocols from EigenLayer as well as other restaking teams?
Yeah, I guess you can also, if you really wanted to, you can launch an EigenLayer backed rollup secured by EigenLayer.
Yeah.
That design is also possible. I guess it really depends on your specific use cases and what you're tackling. If you just want to focus on building a specific app and you don't really need a fully fledged blockchain and like a fully fledged VM, etc. for that app, and you just want to scale that app, then it doesn't really make sense for you to launch a roll up and deal with all the infrastructure, etc. It makes much more sense to launch an AVS and to spin up an AVS and just run this specific app. It's less hassle. So it really depends on your target markets and also like what your demands are in terms of like handling infrastructure, etc.
Got it. I think those are my main two questions that I had following the presentation. I appreciate your time. And thank you for coming out and sharing these slides and these insights. I mean, overall, it's always a fun time with you, but this is a particularly pressing time in this landscape, and that's why we're doing this series. So have learned a lot and continuing to feel that this is a nascent form of EigenLayer, a nascent form of this kind of notion of shared security, and that, as you hinted to, this is not the final form of this protocol design. Slashing for Eigen will go live for Ethereum. Eventually, I think that you're on the right track. I think that we'll see restaked Bitcoin, restaked. I know there's protocols for restaked Tether, these types of things. So I worry a little bit about like the over rehypothecation of like all the coins that possibly we can restake. So yeah, definitely gonna be interesting to watch that part of the equation play out.
Yeah, for sure. You actually surprised me that someone has thought of doing a restaked Tether protocol. That would be an interesting look because I don't know. I think RWAs introduce additional risk, and you have to be very careful with them because let's say if for some reason a restaking contract is sanctioned, then essentially your entire security budget is bricked within 1 second.
Yeah, which is problematic. Yeah, to say the least. But then, like, I mean, the advantages to that system are like you get that understanding that you have this catastrophic mechanism that could absolutely brick you. But like on the other side, you get basically the most stable asset in the crypto markets today to restake.
Oh yeah, I definitely can see the upsides, and so I guess if there was a way to use RAI or something along those, like an actual decentralized stablecoin, then it would be an ideal trade-off where you weren't at risk of a centralized operator pulling some shenanigans on you, but also you would have the most stable asset in terms of volatility that you could have securing your protocol.
Yeah, it just kind of brought me up to something else before we run. What is your immediate thoughts with regards to the idea of this intersubjective token design, aside from like the 45-page white paper, and kind of like the very deep level technical research? I mean, like do you foresee these more like subjective dispute resolutions, or like arbitrary off-chain or on-chain kind of disputes, or even just like in any sort of contractual agreement between two parties, seeing this idea of intersubjectivity coming more and more on-chain? Or like, how do you think about this idea of intersubjectivity?
Yeah, I going back to the 45-page white paper, they lost me at page 25. I'm like, I just don't have the patience to go through 45 pages. But in general, I think I understand that for certain use cases, uh, objective slashing is not possible, and subjectivity is required. So, for example, in the case of oracles, there's no way you can objectively slash an off-chain event, an oracle feed based on an off-chain event on-chain, because your blockchain has no idea what's happening in real world. It can only objectively gauge on based on what facts it's been provided internally. And so for certain designs, I think it's necessary, but I'm also afraid that people are just gonna resort to subjectivity a lot in cases where objective slashing is possible, but it's finicky and you have to like spend a lot of time perfecting the design. And like it's not as easy as like, oh, condition A, condition B, do a small verification and just slash, but it can be like something complex. I can't come up with an example right now, but you can definitely think of some. And people are just going to use this shortcut because it's much easier than actually putting the effort and implementing objective slashing conditions. And therefore, I'm split. I can see why certain use cases would need this design, but I can also see how people would take this as a shortcut because they can't be bothered with designing a more complex system that actually works without introducing assumptions about human behavior, game theory, etc., etc.
Yep. Fair points. Cool. One last thing here, more on the technical side. So each of these EigenLayer AVSs have to write their own slashing logic and their own slashing contracts. In the future, there's going to be more. I mean, things like AltLayer has like this wizard AVS thing that is basically allowing you to kind of like spin up your own AVS, and eventually they'll probably have like more custom made slashing contracts. And I know that the EigenLayer team's working on them. But do you think that having individualized slashing contracts for various types of AVSs, which want to create their own set of slashing rules and kind of slashing logic, do you foresee that as being problematic at all to the EigenLayer design, or even like in the larger case, like the operators and the kind of Ethereum base layer?
It undoubtedly is problematic from the perspective of you having to trust each individual AVS. because they're not standardized, or their slashing mechanics underneath are not standardized. So it is problematic from one perspective, but I think I can envision the end game for the way slashing is actually enforced on chain being similar to, like, for example, how Risk Zero is designed, where you can compile anything into this standardized API and it'll just prove it. And I think you can, obviously that still involves human factor, and that still involves uh, us trusting or assuming that the people who are building those specific AVSs are actually implementing things correctly. But it's much easier to audit, let's say, Rust code than audit a bunch of Solidity, especially nowadays, where certain people like to add assembly, etc., to optimize gas costs, etc. It's not very readable, and so I think if such a design can be thought of, then that would be ideal, because then, one, it makes the life of people who are actually building those AVSs easier, because they don't have to write a bunch of Solidity code, audit it, etc., etc. They can just write in Rust, for example, or whatever, and just compile it. But yeah, I don't know how that will work. It's just like something that I can think of that can minimize both the, not minimize, but reduce the hassle, both from the AVS operator side and also the risk from the user side.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I keep coming up with things. So, pardon me, if you have another couple minutes, we were just nice. We were talking previously before about how the idea of EigenLayer, like the original, like this idea behind this global coordination mechanism, right? And that we can kind of coordinate. I mean, mostly anything off chain, on chain with this kind of intersubjective system, and that, okay, we can build these AVSs out. And the big idea here, similar to rollups, is like, okay, we don't have to build a proof of stake token design that basically we have to inflate away via token emissions to bootstrap validators to basically solve the something, or the nothing at stake problem, to create incentives that work. And so we're now entering this era of a lot of AVSs. I think there's maybe like 30 or 40. I think in coming months, we'll see hundreds probably as these kind of roll up as a service, but AVS as a service platforms really start to hit their stride. And we were kind of just previously discussing before we went live about how the dynamics of EigenLayer enables teams to not need their own token, because they can inherit the security of Ethereum or restaked Ethereum via operators. And so they can basically run these services or these applications, these microservices, however you want to think about them, without the need for a token, which means that builders can focus on the product, marketing, etc., the actual use case, rather than kind of like the token games that we see a lot today. So the full loop here is basically, how are you thinking about this relationship between AVSs and native AVS tokens? And what use cases in particular, because I know that you had kind of just touched briefly on that before, what use cases are you seeing for, like, perhaps for businesses where something like an AVS makes sense, where they don't necessarily need a token? And yeah, I mean, just curious, like, how you see this playing out. Like, are these teams all going to launch tokens? Like, how is that going to work with the AVS? How are they going to do like dual staking, or just kind of what's your vision, and what are some of the more like business use cases for AVSs that may not require a token?
Yeah, I'm actually skeptical about how you can do dual staking within by combining, let's say, for a rollup, by combining their own token and EigenLayer and EigenLayer AVS. I just added unnecessary complexities. So I'll put it this way. So I think the use cases for AVSs and EigenLayer in general are there are a few use cases. So obviously DA, especially if we assume that there's a lot of data that is going to be published on chain, then I think EigenDA makes sense, because Ethereum is unlikely to ever be able to handle the scenario in which we're posting hundreds of megabytes of data per second, let's say. That's one example. And another example is a lot of long tail rollups. I think at some point it'll be more or less accepted that trusting a centralized sequencer is not enough to basically have finality, or what people call finality. It's not actually finality, but let's assume for this conversation's sake, it is finality. And so you would need some form of economic security to have those confirmation guarantees. And obviously for projects, for L2s like Arbitrum, it doesn't really make sense to use EigenLayer, because their token has a large FDV. They can easily attract billions of dollars of economic security through their own token. And so there's no reason. But a lot of smaller projects, or projects where the token doesn't have a large FDV, for those projects, it actually makes sense to use EigenLayer 1, because it will probably be more economical than spinning up your own network and trying to attempt to build your own proof of stake network. And two, it'll definitely provide more security than spinning up your own network. Because another thing to consider that I forgot to mention for large rollups is, ideally you would want to minimize third-party dependencies as much as possible if you're a large rollup and can afford to run your own proof of stake network, et cetera, because let's say if Arbitrum runs their own proof of stake network, then it's only reliant on that, nothing else. Whereas if Arbitrum uses EigenLayer and an AVS from EigenLayer to run the proof of stake network, then it's dependent on EigenLayer functioning as intended as well. And therefore, let's say if EigenLayer suddenly disappears, or it fails for one reason or another, then essentially Arbitrum, maybe not long-term, but at least short-term, mid-term, it's screwed, because it doesn't have that security anymore. And it either has to revert back to centralized sequencer, or spin up some ad hoc design that allows them to basically have some temporary security while they're building a more long-term approach. And so yeah, and I think that's the second category. And then the third category, as I mentioned before, is apps that don't need fully fledged blockchains or fully fledged VMs. I think and they just want to focus on the product that they are offering, and they don't mind paying EigenLayer a certain percentage of the value that they pull, instead of dealing with all the infrastructure themselves. It's like, I think the same argument can be applied to something like AWS. People can build their own hardware in their offices and run their websites from their own server, but the majority of people don't want to deal with the hassle of running your own infrastructure, having essentially your own IT department that deals with that, etc. It's much easier to just like deploy a server on AWS and run it from there. And I think the same thing is true here, even if it might not be as cost effective. Obviously, if you're a massive website, then at that point it makes sense to invest in your own infrastructure, because the money that you spend on AWS might not be very rational. And the same thing is true, like anything that is not like the largest app or the largest rollup, I think, or like the top 5 or whatever, then it actually makes sense to use something like EigenLayer to handle all the pain and hassle of the infrastructure for you, and you just focus on your core product.
Awesome. Scroll AVS soon. No, maybe
yeah, I don't know about that.
Yeah, thank you, Toghrul, for coming out. It's been a great time, and I appreciate you answering those questions in the end there. I had a couple lined up, and then you just brought a bunch more out as usual. So I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Always fun to chat about these things.
Cheers, man.